Thanks, Christoph, and thanks, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody this afternoon, morning, or whatever other time zone you might be in. I hope that you're going to find this to be an interesting conversation. As Christoph said, from my perspective, I think that it's as helpful to have a conversation where you have an opportunity to share your own observations rather than me just sitting here for 40 minutes and sharing what I've seen across the number of different countries that I've had the opportunity to work in. So what I'm hoping to do is to spend probably the next 20 minutes or so just sharing things that I've seen. And I know there are others who are on the line from South Africa, so it might be interesting to hear your thoughts as well. And then to really just open this up for as much of a conversation as possible. Just to give you a little bit of a background on myself, and I will start to share screen just so that you do have a chance to get a sense of this. And I'm looking to see, have you enabled screen share for me?
Würdest du mal die Tür hier so ein bisschen anlehnen? Dass ich hier die Tür so ein bisschen anlehnen, damit ich hier zuhören kann? Okay.
There's somebody who has still his microphone not muted. A German speaker, please mute all your mics.
Okay, so again, just to give you a sense of who I am, because I know it's always helpful to have a sense of who the speaker is and whether they have the credentials to be talking about the topic. I've been working in climate finance and raising money before it was even called climate finance per se for the past 20 years, helping a number of both national governments and subnational governments to raise money for their types of projects. Again, those that are viewed as being resilient, climate finance, or whatever else we want to use as the descriptor or adjective. Raised about $1.3 billion in urban infrastructure alone in advisory roles, basically helping governments and private sectors to access the money for those projects that they need. I have a doctorate from the University of Cape Town in infrastructure finance for sub-Saharan Africa, and I've been a senior lecturer at the Johns Hopkins University in the US since 2010. The question that I'm asked to really discuss today is, what does it look like when we think about the global spread of climate finance? And in this case, I'm looking as recently as possible. So US dollars in billions of dollars, 2019 and 2020, what is the average between those two and where does that money look like it's going? So if you look at this picture, it actually looks like, oh, this is fairly well distributed. And again, from the perspective of thinking about Africa, you'll say, well, 19 billion looks like it's the lowest amount on the screen next to the 16 billion that goes to Middle East and North Africa. But I would argue that a picture like this is actually very misleading and deceptive. Because if you think about this, it looks like everybody is getting some portion of that money. When you look at it this way, again, this is a different way of breaking down those same pieces of information, the same data, and you can see that, yes, East Asia and Pacific ends up having a much higher amount in concentration of money coming in, but there's still, it looks like a fair amount. Yet when we look at it from this perspective, and this is what I really want to call attention to, the fact that the destination by region for climate finance, both from public and private participants, if we look at North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, so the entirety of the two, we're seeing that only 24 billion of the $632 billion that's going for climate finance makes its way into Africa, whether it's North Africa or sub-Saharan Africa. That's a real concern. We can talk all about the fact that there's a lot of exciting things going on, but when we start to really break this down, the numbers are not that exciting for Africa. And we need to figure out why is that the case. And that's something that I'm hoping we're going to be able to get to during the course of the next 30 minutes. Again, looking at this now, this is even more of a disaggregation. So by country, seeing the fact that we're seeing that there's a number of people who are not getting access to the climate finance or the projects that benefit from climate finance that need it. And so looking across this whole picture, we're seeing again that the money flows are just not happening, with South Africa being an outlier. And that's largely the ability to take climate finance on in South Africa. So I'm based in South Africa, and you might say, well, if South Africa, as you're arguing, is the best performer, or the one where we're seeing the highest amount of money move, why would we say that that's happening? And that's really what I'm hoping I can land as messages, but also where some of those concerns are, and the fact that it might not be as rosy or pearly white as everybody would hope it would be in the mobilization of finance in a country like South Africa before we even get to a country like Senegal. So I would say that there are several components that really drive this. The first, what the public sector is doing. The second, what the private sector is doing. The third, global partners outside of South Africa. And then the fourth, some of the intermediation that's going on as far as capital mobilization and money that comes in for climate finance. So when we think about public sector, what do I mean? When we think about public sector in South Africa, probably one of the most exciting things that's happened is the release of a paper last year by a mix of the Ministry of Environment and Forestry as well as the National Treasury, where they looked at how do we see basically sustainable finance get introduced in a way that helps and makes sense. And so from this perspective, last year, this was released as a recommendation that yes, South Africa should have some sort of taxonomy, some sort of guiding light to be able to figure out how to make sure that we're seeing green, social, and sustainable finance initiatives come in, and that the financial services industry, so private capital, can support this. How do we ensure that economic activities are green and that South Africa is positioned as a resilient, competitive, and low carbon economy and society? Some of you might have read about, so the EU has its own taxonomy, the UK is developing a taxonomy. What do all of these mean, and what is a taxonomy? So you'll see what the definition is that a lot of people use at the bottom of the screen, why this is helpful and why this classification is in fact useful. To be more pragmatic and to think about this more practically from the South African perspective, having this taxonomy, which is still in draft form, but nonetheless exists, is something that helps the financial sector to think about how it can start driving some of its capital towards green finance and towards green solutions, which ends up being a major driver for the types of things that we're seeing. So it's not just money coming in from overseas, but domestic resource mobilization that leads to the types of green outcomes that everybody is claiming that they want to see. And so we have this idea of a taxonomy, or a set of definitions and classification, which comes in from the national level, that comes in from the public sector to help to guide. But that guidance is only so far good as the idea of creating the enabling environment. And so the next piece that really helps to drive forward this thinking is the corporate commitments that we see to green. One of South Africa's largest banks, Nedbank, recently adopted a sustainable energy policy, and other banks are similarly looking at how can they do the same thing. Nedbank is similarly looking for ways to green its overall practices. And so it's looking, how do we drive this internally as a private organization and part of the financial sector, but how do we also help our clients to be able to access money for green more effectively? And so the thing that I'm excited and encouraged by is the fact that South African banks are increasingly raising money from institutional investors in the local markets. So they're not going overseas and trying to find how do we get money for green, for climate finance from other parts of the world, but instead, how do we bring this money in from the local institutional investors to on lend to these green projects? Again, Nedbank, being the pioneer for this, issued a corporate green bond, so went to the local capital markets and issued a bond for approximately $117 million US 2 years ago to finance 1 wind farm and 3 solar farms. So a very practical example of the fact that the financial services industry is identifying opportunities to participate in this green revolution and evolution, and that there are investors who also are happy to participate in these bond issuances by putting their money in and expecting to get returns that they feel are acceptable in the market for these types of projects. So we have that happening. And I know that later on today that Helen Avery is going to be speaking a little bit about COP and observations from COP, but thinking about COP26, and one of the most exciting and promising announcements that came from that the fact is that we heard that there is a pledge of $8.5 billion in grants and cheap loans over the next 5 years coming from the United States, the UK, France, Germany, and the EU to be able to help to ensure that South Africa is able to reach and meet its emissions targets under the Paris Agreement, which is compatible with keeping the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above 19th century levels. So that's all really exciting. And for those of you who are listening, you're probably saying, well, this is great. South Africa really has nailed this, and we need to find a way for other countries to do the same and to make all of this work. But I will say that it's not, again, as perfect a picture as those previous 2 or 3 slides shared. Just this week, and again, those of you who are in South Africa and who read some of the rumors that are going out, but things that actually turn into the truth after the rumor, one of the biggest concerns that I saw, this was 2 days ago, the fact that Eskom, so the national energy utility, is saying now that they will be forced to charge an extra 30% in electricity tariffs from next year and to implement continuous stage 8 load shedding. So stage 8 load shedding is basically a shedding of 8,000 megawatts of electricity from the grid, meaning that households and businesses could expect to be without power for 12 hours a day. So half of your day, no energy, because of the fact that Eskom is saying that it needs to get an exemption from minimum air quality standards to allow it to release sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and particulate matter into the environment. And so when we think about it from that perspective, this is exactly the opposite of what we're hearing the rhetoric to be. So everybody's saying South Africa is leading the pack. South Africa is not only decarbonizing its energy sources, but is also the leader in helping to make sure that we see a just energy transition. If we think about this and we think about the fact that just earlier this year, that yet another coal-powered energy plant was brought online by Eskom, there's a mismatch between the rhetoric and the claims that we're going to see $8.5 billion coming in to help to decarbonize the energy system in South Africa, and that we're seeing that new coal power plants are coming online, and that the energy utility is saying, look, we need this relief, and if you don't give us this relief, we're going to lead to tremendous additional either charges or tremendous additional pollution. And so thinking about it from that perspective, there's a problem here. And I again don't want it to be something that everybody feels like, let's follow the South African example specifically. I know that somebody from eThekwini will be on later, and it'll be really interesting to hear from a city's perspective what this picture is as well. But from a national perspective, there are tremendous challenges in being able to achieve all the things that are laid out. The other challenge is the fact that there's a lot of risk that some of these banks still see when looking at the question of green finance or climate smart infrastructure investment opportunities. And they say, we see all these things come in, but other than renewable energy, there's not enough past practice to show that this in fact works. And so we're concerned, our credit committees won't approve the transactions, and we see tens of billions of rands worth of projects that people are bringing in. So hundreds of millions of dollars that we see great opportunities in, and yet we can't seem to make any of these come through and get to financial closure because of the risk. And so one of the things that has been brought forward that I personally think is a great solution is the use of some sort of a credit enhancement guarantee or mechanism that allows for the de-risking of these climate smart infrastructure opportunities. This graphic that you see on the screen is one of those that's being introduced, concept of taking projects and getting project sponsors to be able to access guarantees that help to, again, de-risk what this looks like and allows for cheaper financing to ensure and to accelerate the delivery of capital to these types of projects. To give a sense of what those projects are, again, there's two that have come through regularly as opportunities. One, this concept of how do we help intermediary cities to deliver local renewable energy solutions, partially because of the fact that we do see that there are off-grid or at least non-traditional ways to power the energy needs. And thinking about it from that perspective, this ends up being beneficial for intermediary cities. So intermediary or secondary cities are those that are smaller than the primary or capital cities. And in Africa, the fastest population growth according to UN estimates, is occurring at the intermediary city level, where we see a significant amount of internal migration from rural areas to those intermediary cities. So this is one example of where this sort of a guarantee mechanism helps to drive the mobilization of capital for green finance opportunities in a country like South Africa, where the financial sector is mature enough to be able to start thinking about this. The other thing that I've seen a significant amount of demand for is when private property owners, especially some of the larger conglomerates that own properties, hundreds of thousands of square meters of properties across the country, are looking to retrofit their buildings to be more energy efficient, especially because of the fact that, again, we see wider climate fluctuations. Tomorrow, where I am, it's going to be close to 40 degrees Celsius. And the fact that we see that sort of heat in the summer, and then we see that temperatures can go down to freezing in the winter and houses are not insulated for that, means that everybody in the winter is running their largely inefficient heating sources that are largely from the electric grid. And that in the summer, they're also running their air cons, and that likewise ends up driving prices high and also putting a tremendous strain on the energy grid, such that this becomes something that is largely unhelpful. But like I said, this is not just a presentation about South Africa, so I want to pivot to Senegal and talk a little bit about what I see as opportunities in Senegal. I had the privilege of living in Senegal for 5 years, leading a project for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And so through that work, I had the opportunity to really get my hands and feet dirty in thinking about what does green finance look like for a country like Senegal. And so if we think about the financial maturity of the market, Senegal is much further back than where a country like South Africa is. Much less money available from institutional investors, fewer large banks that help to craft and originate as well as to structure these transactions. And yet there are some exciting things happening. The first one that I'll call attention to is work that the Global Green Growth Institute, or GGGI, is doing as far as helping to think about how do we help those secondary cities. Again, as I described in the earlier slide, secondary cities being those intermediary cities that are the ones that see the largest amount of growth. How do we make sure that we're seeing these sorts of results coming in, and that we're seeing that there's this idea of integrated and environmentally sustainable opportunities for service delivery in the world of wastewater, plastic waste, and waste from electrical and electronic equipment, as well as looking at domestic wastewater. So all of these end up being the types of things that people are not necessarily thinking about. But if we approach from, let's say, a circular economy perspective, which I think all of us would agree is a far greener way of looking at things, ends up driving the right sort of solutions. And so there are people who are working on those financial models, but those financial models in countries like Senegal end up being maybe not as market friendly or market appropriate. So there's a need for not necessarily the corporate pledges and the large domestic financial institutions to look at this as a profit-making opportunity, but instead something where development finance institutions and donors come in to provide grants and concessionary loans. The other piece that I think has been really exciting is what, again, as Dakar is the economic and political capital of the country, ends up setting policy for a lot of others. The work that's gone on with support from the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities program led to the launch of a resiliency strategy that provides a roadmap towards a city that is clean, safe, energy efficient, and poised for inclusive growth, or growth that benefits everybody rather than just those that have assets and financial resources to look at that. And so from all of these perspectives, we see that there's a trajectory for many countries across Africa. Thinking about what South Africa has done and what it's done well, but also where there's room for improvement, and comparing that with a country like Senegal, which is much earlier on its journey, but nonetheless is excited about where things can go. But if you think, again, back to some of those slides that I used to open my presentation, when we look at this, there's still a lack of climate finance going towards Africa. And so the question that I think about, the thing that keeps me up at night, is trying to understand, why does Africa lag the rest of the world in its delivery of green projects, but also in the creative ways that Africa can accelerate the flow of funds to green finance. And so I'll pause here and see first if there are any questions for clarification, and then hand back for Christoph to facilitate the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Yes, many thanks for this really great presentation and in-depth analysis and of the green finance sector in South Africa, or in Southern Africa and Africa at all. Yeah, we have now about 20 minutes for a Q&A and discussion here. I have at the beginning 2 questions from my side. What you described, the situation of the state-run energy provider Eskom in South Africa. This sounds really like a dilemma, but what you described reminded me also to a kind of power struggle, and not like an, let's say reasonable discussion how to solve that problem. Are there any solutions on the table in South Africa how to deal with that dilemma? And the next question is about renewable energies, which you would not need not only in South Africa, but also in many other African countries. Is there already the infrastructure in the industry to establish a new renewable energy sector, for example, small solar industry or wind energy companies? Even if you have the money, but do you have the infrastructure to establish that sector short term?
Great, I'll take both those questions and look forward to questions from others as well. So as far as Eskom, I mean, there's been some really exciting conversations that happened at COP, trying to imagine what this could look like. But there are challenges that are unfortunately faced by Eskom itself, as well as challenges that are external to Eskom, but nonetheless make this problematic. So there's, of course, every utility has problems, and some are just better at masking those problems or being more efficient than others. And so I would say that there's an internal efficiency challenge, and while that is problematic, and it's been the headline news for much of the past year, that I think that it's unfair to blame it exclusively on Eskom. The other portion of the challenge has been the fact that there are Eskom either charges municipalities who then charge the residents of municipalities, and so the residents aren't paying the municipalities who then pay to Eskom. So we end up in a tremendous challenge as far as seeing finances flowing. And we also see that some of the finances that were structured in an era where either the interest rates were different and it's tough to refinance, or, and I would argue this is one of the biggest problems for many countries in Africa, a lot of the loans don't necessarily come in on a local currency basis, but instead on a hard currency basis. So they come in dollars, euros, pounds. And if you see the type of wide fluctuations that have gone on in the past year, where over the entirety of the COVID epidemic, just to give you a sense of it, let's say that the rand was 12 rand to the dollar pre-pandemic. At the worst of it, it was 20 rand to the dollar, which means that it's nearly impossible to service your debt if you use your budget that you created at the beginning of the year, and you couple that with these delinquent ratepayers, and it becomes something that's challenging. So there are some proposals that have been tabled that start to run through what does this look like to potentially restructure that debt, to make that something which is over a longer period of time, but also allows for a decommissioning of some of the existing plants and an introduction of renewable energy. Which brings me to your second question, which is on the renewable energy side. It's been really interesting to see that some of the bilateral aid agencies have put significant effort to help to drive some of these solutions. So as an example, the French have spent some energy not only in helping to try to embed some of the renewable energy generation best technologies, but also to provide, as I mentioned earlier, a credit enhancement or a guarantee that helps to drive some of these outcomes and provide lower cost financing. So I don't think that there's actually as much of a challenge in looking at this. And then the final thing that I would say is that some of the municipalities have been doing some really exciting things. I know we have somebody on from eThekwini and what's happened over the past few years as far as some of the solar installations have been really exciting, and are examples to me of the fact that we shouldn't imagine that there's not either the professionalism, expertise, or technology in South Africa or elsewhere in Africa to be able to take advantage of this. In fact, I would argue that most countries do have this, and especially if we start thinking about off-grid opportunities, that there's no reason why an African country can't be doing the same things as any other country around the world. I see two hands have come up, but Christophe, I'll hand back to you.
Yes, thanks, Jeremy. And indeed, there are two hands up. I give the floor to David first. And please introduce yourself from which country you are, what your background is, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Doctor, for giving us these insights. My name is David Sempala. I am based in Uganda in East Africa, and I'm a regional coordinator for Africa Climate Priority Project. We are mainly an advocacy platform for climate issues across African continent. Just have one question. You've mentioned and you've given us statistics in terms of the finance to scratch your thoughts on whether the problem is on the way we prepare these projects, that they are not appealing to the financiers, or is it about our project models which we tend to adopt in these proposals? What do you think is the major problem? And basically, how best can we best prepare these projects to be bankable, to be attractive to the finance world? Thank you.
Thanks, David. Will you directly respond, Jeremy?
Sure. It's a great question, and it's something that, again, has been attempted by many, but solved by few. And it's really the idea of how do we help to get projects from the very early identification stage, so concept development, straight through to financial closure. And I would argue financial closure is actually not the final stop. In fact, for a lot of people, it's the start of a project, because that's when you actually can start to construct the project, when you need to start worrying about revenue generation and cash flow to be able to service debt if you do take on debt. And from a green perspective, is this actually achieving the goals that we have? Are we seeing a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions? Are we seeing that this decarbonization is in fact working? Are we also seeing benefits from a social perspective? Is this helping to ensure that the price and the tariff associated with energy is lower than what it was when it was something which was coal-fired, or something that relied on fossil fuels? So I think that it's that full gamut that we need to be thinking about. From my perspective, I wouldn't say that there's only one thing that holds us back from being able to get to financial closure. So I'll just name off a few. The first, I think that there's unfortunately an expectation for many people, especially project sponsors, that the second we say that this is a green project, that means that there'll be financial flows. And I think that fallacy has been really problematic. Just because something is green doesn't mean that it's going to be attractive to the financial sector. And arguably even more important, if the financial fundamentals are incorrect on a project, then you're not going to be able to attract money from anywhere that expects a repayment of that. And so I would say that let's make sure that the financial fundamentals work and that a financial model works. Second thing that I'd say is important to think about is when we're looking at some of these different models and instruments, let's find an instrument which is appropriate. If this is something that's generating revenue, donors might say, we don't know if this is really appropriate for a grant, but instead might be something appropriate for concessionary or long-term low interest rate finance. So I think that the choice of the instrument is important, as well as the fundamentals. The final thing that I would say, again, there's so many things that I would say are important, but it's the information and the way that information is shared. I've seen a number of projects that have been proposed, and I feel like, oh, I don't know who put this together. But if I'm sitting as a lender or an investor, and somebody gives me a well-packaged portfolio that I can say, this project looks really good. Everything is clearly presented, the financial model makes sense, and there's full information transparency. relative to something which is a lot of narrative and difficult to parse to get the information that's relevant out of, that can be really problematic. So again, while there are many things I would point to, I'll just name the three that tend to be the biggest challenges. The first, poor financial fundamentals. The second, inappropriate choice of instrument. And the third, poor preparation of the project as far as the way it's laid out. I wouldn't say, in all honesty, that the choice of technology ends up being that problematic, because I think that many entities are actually in a really good place to be able to say this has worked in other geographies and jurisdictions and should be equally appropriate for whatever country or project is looking to lead on that. I hope that helped, but again, as Carol said, the deck will be shared and my contact information is there. Please feel free to be in touch if you have any questions.
Okay, great. Then we have another hand from Kumisa. Please, go ahead. You have to unmute your mic and we can hear you.
Oh,
No.
I thought I did.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
And greetings, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Gorelick, for that presentation. And I wish we would have more opportunities for, discussions like this with the academic sector. That's certainly very important for us in the local government space. For me, my dilemma is not in so much as access to green finance as much as it is with what do you do then to ensure that the finance, that funding now translate to a sustainable green revenue stream within the municipality. Because it's one thing to rely on donors, on loans, but once you have implemented your project, then what about maintenance and operations? This is the dilemma that we're facing now, and I'm hoping that you will still be around when I go through my presentation, because with the municipality and with the problems that we've been through with the pandemic as well as the July civil unrest, and we're not getting enough revenue from our electricity sales. Now, we're battling. I mean, I don't think from the climate change perspective, we are looking for like funding to fund projects to provide proof of concept, but we want to convince the budgeting process of local government to then take on these projects as mainstream municipal business and budget for them the same way they budget for roads, the same way they budget for bridges, for wastewater infrastructure and everything. But that is not happening. And now we introduce something called a single infrastructure plan, where you see even in the methodology that is being used to measure the performance of infrastructure, because at the end of the day, they want to say infrastructure that is not performing is going to be termed risky, and there's going to be no money that will be prioritized to maintain that infrastructure. But nobody knows how to include ecological infrastructure in that mix, because the architecture that is within local government is not used to that terminology. So there is a very resilient architecture that we need to dismantle. So we've done like great things. And I thought, you know what, I have a brilliant business case. I can go out there and look for money, but I take somebody's money. And when that money is finished and the project is in place, and how do I ensure long-term sustainability if I can't convince my own municipality to prioritize long-term sustainability of maintenance of that project in perpetuity, because it is impossible to dismantle what is already in place to accommodate this transformative approach to infrastructure development and resilience at city level. So I've had, there's quite a lot that I have gained from the presentation that you've given, the opportunities that exist, but they don't take me as far as I need to go with what I have. And you will see in the presentation that I'm going to give. I mean, we've come a long way with our own interventions, but we need now to mainstream and then say, well, this is the way of doing business in eThekwini, but it's difficult. So if you have any thoughts on that, I'd really appreciate. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kumisa. And to add that you are from Durban, eThekwini municipality, and you will be later a speaker after the break. Yeah, I think you raised some questions which are not completely unique, I guess, for South Africa. I think we have it in the administration in different countries. Also in Europe, we are facing similar problems. Jeremy, what might be your response to it?
So that's a great point. And I'll answer in two different ways. So the first thing I'm going to do is to respond specifically to Kumisa and what I see in eThekwini. So I've had the privilege of working with your outgoing CFO, with Krish, on a number of different projects. In fact, right now I'm supporting through the UK government, the Prosperity Fund Future Cities South Africa program in eThekwini on the transit-oriented development question. I do think that the challenge for a municipality like eThekwini is that thinking about the millions of dollars required, so the tens and hundreds of millions of rand required just to rebuild after the unrest of July, makes this almost impossible to say, okay, let's reprioritize, let's think about climate smart interventions. So it's sad that that's where things are, but I also appreciate that there's a deeper and more fundamental question that would exist whether or not we had the unrest, whether we have COVID, and part of that is the packaging of these opportunities. And so one of the things that I find when I speak to people from the environment team of a city and then speak to the finance team is the finance team says, well, Jeremy, what you're saying is very different than what we're hearing the opportunity to be. So we hear the opportunity is, how do we go about getting access to new funding to be able to install, let's say, a solar installation or renewable energy or energy efficient buildings? But nobody's actually told us what the benefit is beyond the environmental benefit. And so Kumisa, what I would argue, and I would love to work with you on putting this together in front of the CFO and others, and really to any other city leader, let's stop talking about this as being a climate or an environment emergency. Yes, it is, that's the reality, but that's not where the people are thinking who are making the financial decisions. Let's reframe the conversation and be able to show very clearly how this is either a revenue generator or a cost savings, and how the cost savings or the revenue generation will over time, so if we can talk about long-term funding, how this ends up being more beneficial than if we were to follow business as usual. The other way I would answer this, and to Christophe's point, this is not exclusively a South African or even an African problem. This is a problem that cities and subnational governments around the world face. They have challenges in being able to think long-term about these questions. They have challenges in being able to figure out how they intelligently access the finance that's required. And they have challenges as far as the political prioritization of some of these issues. Just to give you an example, I'm providing support to the Greater London Authority. So the people in London making decisions, the Mayor of London working on creating a long-term future finance facility that will get London to net zero by the year 2030. The same challenges, Kumisa, that you're saying are facing eThekwini are facing London, as far as how do we prioritize, how do we make all of this work? All of these end up being far less transparent. And so this is This is something that we need to recognize as a reality and potentially a challenge. I know that we're almost at the end of my session of today, but I see that Mary has her hand up. So Christoph, maybe we'll take hers and then hand over to Helen.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jeremy. And actually, we are really at the end of this session because Helen has another obligation after 50 minutes or 40 minutes. So she can come back later to our panel discussion. So I really would like to finish now our session here. And Mary, I can promise you that you will be the first in our panel discussion. You can speak to the audience here.